Hello, my name is Chelsea Harris. I'm a second-year law student at the University of Victoria and a member of the Environmental Law Club here on campus. And we are so pleased to welcome author and communications expert Jim Hoggan to come and speak with us about the toxic state of public discourse, particularly the lies and misinformation that circulate around climate change and other environmental issues. Jim has a law degree from the University of Victoria, right here, one of our alumni, and he's also president of one of the most successful PR firms in Western Canada, as well as being the past chair of the board of the Suzuki Foundation. And Jim became so interested in public discourse and a lot of the lies that circulate and misinformation that circulate that you spent 4 years researching, and you have written a book, I'm Right and You're an Idiot. So thank you for coming today, Jim.
Thank you.
One thing that you mentioned in your talk today that I found really interesting is the fact that just like we pollute our environment, we can pollute our public debates and our public conversations, and that both are things that need to be protected and both are things that are a public good. What I'm wondering about is, particularly around climate change, it seems silly that we still consider climate change having a debate, that we're still debating these issues that seem so clear factually and scientifically. So can you explain why it is that people don't believe scientists?
Yeah, I think that there's a general state or general growth in public mistrust in government, in industry, and to some degree in science. Even though academics and scientists are among the most trusted people, the sort of general level of public trust has decreased in Canada and the United States. So that's part of the reason. And so I also think that there are other barriers. One of them is that the problem has been presented in ways that people don't see as having a lot to do with them personally. You know, they got a lot to worry about. Elke Weber at Columbia calls it the finite pool of worry, right? We have so much on our minds and so many things to concern us. Something else comes along, we need to make room for it, and we're not going to make room for it if we wonder about how serious it is for us to begin with. So if we think it's about polar bears, then, you know, it's not that we don't care about polar bears, but, you know, we're worried about a lot more things that are a lot more immediate. Right. So that's part of the problem.
Right. So do you think that maybe people are overwhelmed by the amount of information that they're receiving? Is that feeding into the problem? The amount of information has increased with new media? And I'm also curious, do you see this as a problem that has its roots in our sort of own psychologies and tendency to want to tribalize as an effect of our evolution? Or is this something that has an issue that has maybe increased or been enhanced in recent years? And why that change?
I mean, there is a problem of public anxiety around the amount of information, you know, that we're expected to know something about. Mm-hmm. And so there's no doubt about that I think people are anxious about the amount of information. There's also fear about something that could be so catastrophic and at the same time something you can do so little about. And I also think that people are worried that if they do something, the guy across the, you know, if they buy a new plug-in Leaf, the guy across the street still may buy a Ferrari. Mm. You know, and so there's this kind of general erosion in social trust. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a combination of things like that basically have led to less demand for change than you would think, given what the evidence is telling us. I mean, and there's another part of it too, that we seem to be listening to each other shout. Mm-hmm. a lot rather than listening to what evidence is trying to tell us. And I think that kind of, it sort of sucks oxygen out of the public square.
Right. Can you explain maybe some of the, I know you spoke to a number of sociologists and I believe psychologists in writing your book, and can you explain some of the sort of social psychology behind some of the phenomena that we see?
Yeah, well, one of the people that I talked to is this interesting sociologist who teaches at Yale Law School. His name is Dan Kahan, and he works on a project called the Cultural Cognition Project, where they're looking into the effect that our cultural affiliations manipulate scientific evidence that disagrees with whatever the beliefs of our cultural group are. And so they look at things like people's perception of the seriousness of climate change. They look at something like gun control. And what they look for is this tendency that we have to, if evidence comes along that contradicts the beliefs of our group, we tend to change the evidence as opposed to changing our beliefs. And it's kind of what I call the tribalizing of science. So you basically start to believe that this isn't something that people like us believe. And if you believe this, you can't be one of us, you must be one of them. So when science is seen that way through the eyes of what other people call, social scientists call my side bias, when the glasses of my side bias filter the science of climate change, you basically will get people who are just totally non-believers. And that's it. It doesn't matter how much evidence you give. All the evidence is just used to basically reinforce what they already think.
Right. I'm curious too about, because you mentioned this is an issue that we see both in Canada as well as in the United States. I know you are involved in the Desmog blog. You helped create and start up the Desmog blog, which has both focuses on toxic discourse around climate change, both in Canada and false science, frankly, both in Canada and in the U.S. To what extent do our political institutions play into that? To what extent does, especially in the United States, especially with Trump, where we see these very, us versus them, Republican versus Democrat sort of conversations and this extreme polarization, how do you think that plays into people's tribalizations and their us versus them mentalities?
Well, the reason that the President of the United States can get away with saying that climate change is a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese and people not just burst out laughing is because there are a whole bunch of people who support him who actually think that. They don't think there's any real serious problem with climate change. And one of the reasons they think that is because there have been decades of propaganda that's basically been aimed at trying to shape this, tribalized interpretation of science. And it's basically convinced a lot of people who should know better that climate change isn't a problem. And once you do that, it's very difficult to actually change people's minds. There are people who are actually working on it right now. There are groups in the United States who are studying how you talk to Republicans about climate change, and quite successfully. Yeah. So there are ways that you can change the language. Part of what the problem is that when we massage science with our values, whether we're on the right or on the left, whether the facts are on our side or not, when we massage values into science, we can get reactions that are kind of unintended and opposition that's unintended. A lot of the time when, Dan Kahan will say, look, you may think that they're saying that climate change is a hoax, and that is what they actually said, but what's really behind that is their concern that you're really, building a Trojan horse to advocate for big government when they don't want it. And so I think that the conversation around climate change and a lot of the other big environmental issues that we face today is a lot more complicated than we think.
Yeah. So how do you get to start having those complicated discussions, and how do you break past those tribalizations and break past people attaching themselves to or massaging their values into the issues, as you say? How do you engage in meaningful discourse?
Well, it's interesting that one of the biggest upticks in concern about climate change in the United States, and it was significant, one of the biggest upticks came after the Pope's encyclical in the United States, which, if you haven't read it, take a look at it. I'd encourage anyone to look at it and learn what a powerful moral narrative is. And I think that's a part of it. But another part of it is who's speaking. You know, when things become tribalized, people trust their tribe members. So Al Gore is not the best guy to talk to Republicans about climate change. They need somebody else who's, you know, part of the Republican community. And I also think we need to get better at what you might call pluralistic advocacy, where you talk to people in a way about these issues where they can see themselves on both sides of the issue, rather than polarizing it as an us and them kind of conversation. You basically try to include people in it so that they can see themselves in the narrative. And I think it's not impossible. A lot of people are actually working on this right now, and I think with great success.
Great. And we can read more about it in your book.
For sure.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming to UVic to speak with us today. Yeah, it's been a pleasure to host you, Jim.
Very nice to meet you, and thank you so much.